right. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and for those tuning in at home. Our regular chairperson, Francis Gagnon, is out tonight, so he asked me to fill in. All right. So, agenda item number 2, to receive and approve the second reading of the Regional Service Center Agreement. Is there any discussion from the board? Ms. Hutchinson.
First, thank you, Mr. Webster, for responding to those questions. One of them, on the question that this raised, was if the pilot site is RSU 10, does that mean our 3 to 5 year olds from Lewiston, Auburn, RSU 16, and RSU 52 would be going to RSU 10?
No, that pilot site is a pilot site of Maine DOE, but they would just be dealing with the students in RSU 10. I'm hoping to get the draft FEDUS grant contract from the state over the next week. And in it, we talk about a pilot site, but it is looking at the relationship and how some of these service providers do their work with our students. So there's no relationship.
Another one is on the answer for number 2, the cost of a director to oversee our work to better understand the CDS process, plan for implementation, and implement 2 years from now, if we deem it the appropriate course of action. Who would determine if it is the appropriate course of action? Would that be on the 4 superintendents making up the board, or would that come back to the school committees?
So first, the school committee would need to decide whether to accept the FEDUS grant, number one. And number two, if, and I may be jumping ahead to another question, the question of whether or not the director for the FEDUS grant, the CDS work, would be a Lewiston Public School employee or not, that would be a decision for this board as well.
And yes, that does lead to the next question. We would be asked to decide whether or not the grant-funded position would be a Lewiston Public Schools employee, just like this board was asked on Spence for the use of Longley. Am I correct?
Spencer Trailer, that's correct, yes.
And if we chose to make this a public schools employee, what happens if it's determined that this is not what's best for our children, and do we end up having to keep that employee on?
Yep, a good question. So it would be clear from the front that this was a grant-funded position. So if the grant were to cease, then that employee would no longer be an employee. I think before we get to that point, this board would be meeting to determine whether or not this was something that we wanted to continue, particularly depending what's going to happen with the state, which is a big question at this point.
Boy, you must be reading tonight. The state has tabled the CDS thing, and they're going to do a workshop again tomorrow. If they should choose to fix it some other way than bringing the 3 to 5 year olds under the public school system, would that mean we would stop doing it? And if so, how would we get out of a contract that we're in?
So under the grant proposal, we would spend 2 years studying and developing a plan, better understanding who the kids are, what are the services they're getting, who are the service providers, how is case management done, all those things. If, let's say the state were to decide not to go down that road at all, then this board would have the decision to make whether we would still like to implement because we think it's in the best interest of students and if we'd worked out the funding and all that, or we would table that work and it would go on the shelf until such time as perhaps the state changed its plans.
can give you a moment, Ms. Hutchinson. Does anyone else have any comments at this time? Ms. Roy?
So while this is being studied, what's happening? Is CDS still continuing even though it's a supposedly broken system?
CDS is continuing. I think that it's a tough time for them. They've been underfunded. They have been attacked. They have many of their employees that are uncertain. And one of the things, and I've talked to Roy Fowler, the CDS director, about that, is if some or all of these responsibilities ultimately end up becoming the responsibilities of the schools, it's not like we have extra providers. The existing providers out there are very much going to be needed. Those CDS employees are going to continue to be very much needed. And so one of the things I would hope as we sit down with CDS is to work out a transition plan, because everyone that's employed in the Androscoggin County office should continue to be employed.
Ms. Hutchinson?
Okay, doing some research and looking at the minutes for the other school boards. It was MSAD 52. Their board was told that the executive director must be hired to run that regional service center, and there must be a board as well. The state will pay 55% of the executive director's salary, and member districts must pay the remaining 45. Is that different from what you're telling us?
I have heard that, but at this point in time, we do not, our executive director is receiving a compensation of 0. So our focus was to protect subsidy, and I think that if there's to be any assessment, it would be something that would only make sense if this and the other boards actually agreed to it. So we're a long way from that. I don't envision that we will have, even if approved, I don't envision that we're going to have a paid executive director anytime soon.
And one final question. In regards to withdrawing, what are the consequences if we determine that this is not what we want to do and we want to withdraw at any point, either now or in the future?
So at this point, and this contract is, I think, terminates within 2 years if not renewed, something to that effect. There would be the only consequence to Lewiston at this stage of the game would be the loss in state funding of the roughly $200,000 that's in our ED 279, and we would expect the amount under present law is due to double next year to a $400,000 difference. We'll see if the law changes. And then this year, DOE is kicking in another $97,000. And one of the things that and I've talked to my fellow superintendents about this, if somehow we could use that money to, for example, pay for the substitute software that we're presently using. It's called Frontline, used to be called ASOP. So we're looking at ways, are there things that the service center could pick up using the state money that would relieve some of the local districts of those financial costs. But at this point in time, we're a long way from there being any discussion of an assessment and what the implications would be for Lewiston if, upon having an assessment, then chose to withdraw.
Ms. Parks?
On the subject of withdrawal, it says if the school committee approves withdrawal, withdrawal would be effective provided that the commissioner approves the withdrawal and a withdrawal agreement is entered into with the board of directors of the RSC. So does that mean that we really don't have any say in it?
As my understanding in talking to the commissioner, he just wants to make sure that a district wouldn't be withdrawing in order to leave the other districts with some big financial burden. I don't see anything like that for at least the next 2 years, unless this board were to approve entering into an assessment with the hiring of employees, which is one reason I like the idea of, if we do have an employee, having it be an employee of Lewiston Public Schools, then this board completely controls what's going to happen.
Mr. Kerr?
So I'm struggling with the regional service center and then the CDS. I mean, shouldn't these be two totally different subjects?
So the Regional Service Center in law requires that there be at least two functions from two of four different categories. So when coming up with the two functions, what we've been thinking about thus far is, number one, collaborating with leadership development. Like, we could bring in a speaker paid for with the DOE funds that all four participating districts could send their aspiring leaders to, or principals to, what have you. So that's one category. The second category, we pick CDS, so the FEDIS grant automatically satisfies one of those categories, and with the same districts. And so the expectation is that that would be, in effect, become part of the service center work.
Hesitate. So by law, we're required to provide education to 6 years. How old?
So are you talking about special education
No,
services?
just education in general. What's the requirement of our district?
So we're required to service any 5-year-old and up that shows up. You don't have to show up unless you're at least age 7. And in Lewiston, we also have, in effect, universal pre-K for 4-year-olds. That is not a requirement of law. So, for example, if we're full, we can turn someone away, but we can't be full in kindergarten. We cannot turn away any 5-year-old.
Oh, you turn that off on. So is the state DOE trying to shift it so that all districts are going to be responsible for the 3 and up?
That is the initial proposal, but DOE recognizes that this is a big black box for a lot of districts, and so one of the reasons they preliminarily awarded the FEDIS grant to Lewiston, and they also awarded it to Biddeford, was trying to see if they could, if a model could be developed that could be used by other districts across the state.
So why not use the pilot project? Or is that are they separating it from the CDS issue versus the
So the if you're talking about RSU 10,
yeah. If that's where the pilot project is.
well, that was the district that DOE designated as a pilot site, and they provided some funding, but nothing has happened at this point in time. So I think they're viewing the FEDIS grants as something that maybe will help kickstart that a little more. And because between the 4 districts up here and Biddeford, we're probably representing about 20% of the students presently in CDS, where the RSU 10 was a small number, but even then they have not been providing any services as of yet.
It just feels like we have some struggles in this community that we haven't overcome yet, and it ranges in all directions. Poverty, but low graduation rate. Just I could go on. Shouldn't we be really getting ourselves grounded in our foundation before we encourage additional services, like bringing in almost like special ed services from 3 years old and up?
So I think that's an appropriate question to ask, but I would suggest that the CDS services should in fact be the very foundation you're talking about. What's happened is that too many students come to us from CDS that have been identified for special ed services but haven't been receiving them. So we bear the cost of that. They stay in special ed service much longer than would have been the case had they received services from the time they were identified. Secondly, we have too many students that are arriving at our doors in that 3 to 5 year or that 4 to 5 year old window that should have been identified for special ed services and never were even referred to special ed. And the longer the delay, the greater the cost in servicing their needs. Right now, because keep in mind that some students start in special ed and then ultimately exit, or they get referred to special ed, and as they get older, they ultimately exit. But of those students that are in special ed at the time that they would have otherwise graduated, for those students, we have a graduation rate of less than 50%. And these are numbers I was just looking at over this weekend. And while I don't have the data to show it, I've got to believe that a portion of that starts because of either the lack of services being provided or the lack of identification for those 3 to 5 year olds.
So, one of the things talked about in the workshop last week in Augusta was lack of funding for CDS is why some of these services are not provided, and that they were unable to pay providers the going rate, and providers were leaving. What makes you think we would be any more successful under the current climate in paying providers to stay and work with our children just because we're the public school?
So another good question. One, I don't see Lewiston or any other district moving forward in this without a funding model that makes sense. And I think one of the challenges with CDS is that because they haven't really partnered with the public schools, they don't have any advocates in Augusta other than themselves and some of the parents and groups that they service. So part of this work will be to not only wrap our arms around the number of students, the financial commitment, but also the funding model that needs to happen in order for it to make sense. And, to that point, every other state, and I'm no expert in this, but it's my understanding, every other state has switched to these services being provided by the local school district because it makes sense. Maine just hasn't figured out how to make the switch, at least not yet.
We can't fund our schools fully to meet the needs of the students we currently have in our schools. We are cutting the budget. We are going to required minimum local share. Our taxpayers cannot absorb more debt on their taxes. I cannot support something that we are not 100% sure right now where the funding sources are going to be. Change is coming in Augusta. We don't know what's going to happen come November. We don't know the route anything is going to take. And I said before, I'll say it again, we are jumping feet first into something and we shouldn't be.
Any other comments, questions from the board? Ms. Quartermunch?
So if I understand correctly, there's nothing happening in RSU 10 with this. So in essence, we would become the pilot program?
I'm not saying that something isn't going to happen to RSU 10, but in speaking to the superintendent there as of a week or two ago, there was nothing that yet had happened that represented a plan or a blueprint in order for them to assume those CDS services. So again, this board is going to get that FEDIS grant. Again, we're waiting for the contract. We're negotiating with DOE on that, and then to bring it to you. The Regional Service Center, it wouldn't have to be the FEDIS grant. I mean, we're talking, this FEDIS grant is a $700,000 grant. It's not inconsequential. But I would look at the Regional Service Center is we're indeed walking before we're running, and all we're trying to do is preserve funding for Lewiston Public Schools to the tune of $200,000 this year and $400,000 next year, unless the law changes.
Any other comments from the board? All right, seeing none, I can share a few of my own. Like most of what we do, we have to look at the trade-offs. I see benefits to a regional service center in the sense that some things could be consolidated. Think of economies of scale. We could do things more efficiently. Thinking as a former sub, that honestly could be done better at a regional level. So I do see some benefits to that, especially like ordering food, things like that. Part of the negatives I see is it seems like it'd be a board of directors, not a single elected official that would be able to basically tell districts that they have to spend a certain amount of money. So to me, it's a little hard to reconcile that.
Could I address that point?
Oh, absolutely.
So there will be no assessment by the Regional Service Center without the board approving it as part of the budget. And, I think that's something that the board, needs to be looking at each year to the extent there's even any discussion of an assessment.
Okay, absolutely. Let's see. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it could be down the road. I'm also a little disappointed that the first time we really got to see the agreement itself was really when we're being asked to approve it. Personally, I would have liked to have seen maybe oversight on the regional service center, be the superintendent and then two school committee members of each district. Go and make the decisions, give it that oversight, so that way there is elected official oversight. I would have preferred that. Based on the withdrawal agreement that I see, and it sounds like Dan Stockford kind of clarified that, you need to get approval by the commissioner, and then approval by the existing board of directors minus our director. So to me, it doesn't seem like we would have control over if we want to. We'd have to get into an agreement. It wouldn't be in our hands.
Can
And
I address one other thing you mentioned?
sure.
So there's no question that this whole regional service center thing it's happened fast. It was kind of tucked in the budget back last July 1st. It's not the way you like to see doing business. We didn't even get a draft of a possible agreement until about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. But I'd be more than happy to talk with my fellow superintendents. We're not trying to pull the wool over someone's eyes or run this independent. I'm more than happy to have, we could have board representation from every district. We could definitely amend the agreement to do that. And I've got no problem with that. I think, though, that in many respects, running the service center or what the service center would be involved with is no different than what a superintendent does day to day now. I mean, we're making decisions every day that don't involve board, but they're just consistent with board policy and with the budget that board does. But I'd be more than happy to entertain an amendment. And all I'm trying to do right now is just get a reasonable document passed in order to preserve subsidy and the money that's in our budget.
Let's see. So in that case, let's see. Sorry, it's easier to think when you don't have the chairship. Okay, yeah, and I do also worry about the money too, like 200,000 for this year, and then like 400 the next year. There's also the uncertainty with the state about what they're gonna do. Personally, I don't think I'm comfortable approving this. If it was amended at some point, absolutely. I know the U.S. Constitution was passed and the assumption that it would be amended, and then it was. I'm not sure if we want to take that approach here. So that's where my uncomfortability comes in. Share that. Any last comments by members of the board? Mr. Kerr?
So I'm a firm believer in regionalization efforts, but I don't think this district has a good history of that. I mean, the couple of times that some cooperative stance was taken with the city, it didn't work out, and I honestly believe it was because we didn't all try hard enough on both sides, between the city and the school. We face part of our budget issues come from the state, and we have faced it for years and years, that we're cutting, and the only way we're going to be able to get around some of these cuts is by some type of cooperation. The only thing I've read, and everything I've read about this subject, were two things, and I was kind of disappointed in that, but the substitute issue, so the districts working together for substitutes, and then CDS. And I kind of struggle with both. One, I think the substitute is a minor issue, and if that's what's at the forefront for this regional agreement, then someone's not thinking big enough. So I throw that out there. I mean, this really could save our district a ton of money if it was done appropriately, but nobody's talking about, the things like merging departments. And that's the type of stuff that I think needs to be discussed in this regional effort. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about increasing taxpayer responsibility by taking over CDS, and we're talking about substitutes. And I think I agree with you, Bill, on the importance of grabbing these kids when they're young. I'm just not, if the DOE or whoever funds CDS would just cough up the money that they promised years ago, we probably wouldn't be in this position right now. So I'd like to see regionalization happen, and maybe regionalization after that, after the vote on the combination between the two cities is probably a bad word. But if we don't, we're all going to put ourselves out of business, or we're going to increase our taxpayers' debt significantly. So why we're here, I think, now is because at the very last minute, we're being asked to approve this. We need to do it quickly because there are funding involved, and that just, that makes it hard for us to truly be able to absorb the possible benefits, because all we're hearing is CDS and substitutes. So every other district's approved it, though, so we have to look at this. Every other district is well on their way to approving it. Okay. One possibly hasn't had the vote yet, but in general, it seems like the momentum's in Auburn to support this. Are you hearing anything differently?
My understanding from Auburn was that they did approve it last week. I haven't looked at the motion or anything, but that was my understanding from Katie Grondin. And we did do some, I agree with you wholeheartedly that we need to be thinking broader on this, and in the draft budget, that is the allocation of that $97,000 from the department. We did some brainstorming in terms of, but we don't know the answer to this, but we could hire a consultant to look at, does it make any sense to consolidate nutrition purchases? Now, Lewiston's already a big nutrition department, but maybe with the addition of Auburn in particular, we could save another X% on food. And there are other things that we think we can do, but you're right, we're just at the infancy, and right now we're just trying to get it created so that we can preserve subsidy, and then, again, happy to pursue amending the agreement to put, I don't need to be on this board. All I'm trying to do is to get it move forward. I'd be happy to have my position taken by a board member, and we can. And I'm confident that a reasonable proposal that my colleagues we all care about kids and want the best for our district, so I'm sure that we could work something out.
So if this fails tonight, what happens next? I mean, will another attempt be made in the near future to try to make this go through?
No, I say if this board bails tonight, this will go forward with the other three districts, and we'll have to cut our budget by 200,000, and I'll go on to other things.
So I personally am going to suggest that we pass this. Somehow we have to make sure we have protections, that if we don't see this regional center working in a direction that's going to help us reduce costs for our taxpayers, I want to be able to pull from it quickly. I just think the risk of not taking advantage of something that truly could save taxpayers money by letting the process start is too great. And we already overtax our community, and I think this is one piece that we actually could go in the other direction if it's done properly and with good oversight.
All right. Any other comments from the board? All right. Just thinking of it procedurally, I mean, it seems like there are two options. We could have a motion to approve or receive and approve the second reading, or we could have a motion to table the item. So to me, it seems like those would be the two options that we would go. 'Cause tabling is essentially just not passing it. That's the way I'm looking at it. Any comments?
Oh, if we table, that means we'd come back to it. And if the timing wouldn't be right, is that correct? Or,
So if Dan Stockford were here, he could answer this question better than I. If the board passes it tonight, then we seamlessly go to the council tomorrow to set the May 8th election. They have to set it at least a month in advance. So if it was tabled, I don't believe that we could meet the deadline for the May 8th election. We could use the June 12th election, but according to Kathy Monteo, it's going to cost us thousands of dollars more because every ballot for the June 12th election has to be machine countable. And there's a format, and you have to send it out of state to have the ballots done, where the May 8th election, everything is a ballot that Kathy Monteo does, and they tabulate it manually.
So Luke, your statement about table, but then basically not doing it, let it sit there, is that what you're suggesting?
An indefinite table, yeah. So it could be brought up if something changed. So it wouldn't be definite, but we could always change that decision too. I figured tabling would just be easier.
Yeah, I just think we're not, I mean, this should be voted up or down, I think, unless there's a reason for table. And if you think that Bill can get back to us with something that would be beneficial, I just don't think we should table it if we're really, if we're not interested in passing or denying this. So I would encourage that we go up or down on this.
Okay. Oh, that makes sense. Like something I was thinking in my mind is if I was like against the agreement, but I wanted to see it amended for it to pass, by tabling it, we could give it time to be amended and then come back to it. That was kind of what I was thinking.
I think that's a valid reason, but that isn't what I thought I heard. If we're truly going to instruct the superintendent to come up with things that would allow us to agree with this or get us to a more comfortable point, then I would agree a table is probably appropriate. But if we're not going to do that, if people are just dead set against this, it just should be, let's just deal with this so that we can move on.
So, and I don't know whether this would be an interim or something in between, but if the board were to pass the agreement tonight, it could be followed by a second motion that would direct the superintendent to seek a change in the agreement, whether it's on board membership or something. Again, the agreement as drafted came directly from the attorney, so we didn't look at it from the standpoint that you've been looking at it, and there's nothing that would prohibit the board makeup from being different or any of the provisions for that matter. There is a provision in the document to make changes. So if it did pass and then there was another amendment, I would seek to and have confidence that that those changes could be made.
Ms. Roy.
so what happens if we pass it here, goes to voters, and they say no, do we still lose out on that funding?
So if, my understanding, if voters say no, we would get, under present law, we'd get a revised E-279 with that money taken out. That's correct.
Great. Okay. I like the idea of amending it because I do want to say I'm not opposed to the idea of a regional service center. If it saves money, it's a smart idea. I just worry about the oversight and the ability of I mean, the school committee to have as much control over it. So I would be open to having our representative to the board be one of us, an elected official. What the other school boards, districts do, I mean, that's on them. Um, I know with the directive to amend it is good, but it's not a guarantee that it will be amended. From my understanding, I may have overlooked it. So it's once two districts approve the agreement, it makes it official come like 2 months from now or so, if I remember right.
Provided that the voters approve it, yes.
Okay, for the voters. So I mean, at this point, assuming those districts' voters approve it, it's going to become in place in the next few months. So I'd be supportive if we could amend it. I just want to ensure that and not kind of think, let's get into the agreement and then ask if we can change the agreement afterwards. I'd rather go into the agreement with this being stated. Yep.
Obviously, I can't speak for my colleagues, but they're all reasonable people, and I think a reasonable request from this board, they're going to see, and their boards would see the same benefit to it. So obviously I can't guarantee anything because I don't speak for others, but I don't see there being any problem getting support from my fellow superintendents because the intent is, we aren't trying to control something. We're just trying to move this ahead to protect subsidy.
Last question I can think of: can the agreement be amended before the service center actually constitutes?
Not within the May 8th timeframe. Certainly beyond that, but I would say that, well, again, not within the May 8th timeframe.
Ms. Roy, did you have a question? Oh. Okay. Any other questions, comments by the board?
So before we take this vote, I mean, I wonder, should we be feeling the pulse on the amendment piece if other board members are comfortable with that, or your call on that?
I mean, I'm open to it. If you guys wanted to share your thoughts quickly, I mean, I figure we could just make the motion and see how it goes. If any of you want to share your thoughts on now, that perfect time. If anybody has any strong feelings. Okay, no worries. Well, I mean, I guess if there's no, let's go much.
I think it's just hard to speak about an amendment without knowing if the other parties how they will feel about that. I mean, we can talk about an amendment in this room, but we don't know that will ever come to fruition with the other parties.
So under the agreement as presently drafted, this board would want to decide by February 1st whether to seek withdrawal for the second year. And there's obviously not going to be an assessment this year. So a second motion could well be, I move something to the effect that the school committee not seek to stay in the Regional Service Center agreement beyond 1 year unless the agreement is amended to include board membership on the board of directors.
Let's go much.
I believe the agreement reads you have to withdraw by November 1st.
Whatever date.
Okay.
Chair.
So not only, the board representation, but anything else. So I would be very comfortable with the way it was worded by the superintendent. But before we zip this out, I mean, are there other things that we think would be important? And I can't think of anything right off the top of my head, but, you know, the same list that I had given earlier, you know, that should be much broader in our trying to solicit savings for our taxpayers, et cetera, but I'll leave it at that.
So I'm a little late to the conversation, just trying to absorb everything. This isn't about the amendment. So my question is, if we're supposed to be getting 200,000 for whatever we want to use it for, but then we take on this CDS kids, what's that costing us? It's going to cost more than 200,000. What am I not understanding about? Oh, the 700,000. Okay, sorry.
So if the center agreement is approved, and we're not even doing that tonight, if the FEDIS grant is approved, this board is still not making any commitment about whether to take on any responsibilities in the CDS. The grant is entirely intended to provide us with the knowledge, the data, the planning in order to implement should we want to do so. So there's no additional obligations on the part of this board at this time.
So that just made me want to clarify out loud. We are not voting for the FEDIS grant tonight. We are voting to move forward in the regionalization process. And we could put an amendment in that says if it isn't amended by the end of the first year, by November 1st, we don't go on to the second year. So we're building in protections. And we're not making the huge decision of the FEDIS grant tonight. So those are two separate things. Thank you.
Just to clarify, if we did make that motion, would we still have to get approval from the commissioner and the board of directors to withdraw, even if we had a motion that we made?
So technically, yes, but at the same time, because no assessment had taken place, this board and this district would be relieved of any financial obligation going forward because it hadn't made any commitment.
Okay, so no financial obligation, but the board could decide that, no, you can't leave. You stay in the next year, and then they would assess something. So it is possible.
Not if this board didn't approve it as part of its budget.
Okay. All right. Any last comments, questions? All right. Does anyone want to make a motion? If not, Mr. Carey.
I was just hoping somebody else would. So I'd make a motion that we enter into a regional service agreement with the amendment that, a board, so the amendment we want is a board member a committee member being on the board. And is there anything else? This is our opportunity to, if the votes are there, if 4 people know they're not voting for it, I guess it won't matter. But I want to make sure we're not missing out on an opportunity here. And I apologize for just not saying the amendment. But
No worries at all. Okay, because I know it's been mentioned, to have our representative be one of the elected board, and then we could also include what you mentioned, how if the amendments haven't been made by November 1st, that will be the board's
Yes.
aim
Cutoff
to
date.
withdraw. Okay.
do you have enough info there, Bill?
Let me draft this since it should be.
If you can think of anything else that we could throw in there that might garner any more support, that would be good.
So this is what I have. Move to enter into the Regional Service Center agreement with the understanding that Lewiston Public Schools will cease to continue membership beyond this fiscal year should the agreement not be amended to place a Lewiston School Committee member on the Regional Service Center Board.
All right.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So that was a motion by Mr. Care. Is there a second? Second by Ms. Roy. All right. Any discussion? All right. All those in favor? 1, 2, 3. All those opposed? 4. The motion fails 3 to 4. Is there another motion? All right.
If I could just say, what would be helpful to me as superintendent, because this passed 8-1 the last time we met, is please, if you have concerns about something, speak to me so that we can do the work to make sure all your questions and concerns are answered. I would have been better, I think, having Dan Stockford here tonight to answer a lot of the concerns. Would appreciate a motion if someone has an idea about what 4 positions we're going to cut from Lewiston Public Schools.
Ms. Hutchinson.
I say we discuss that on Wednesday when we look at the positions that we're looking to put back into the budget cuts that have already been made.
If we could, Bobby, could you add to our discussion list for Wednesday? Okay, thank you. Okay, well, seeing no other motions on the agenda item, Mr. Kerr?
I'd make a motion that we enter into executive session to conduct a student disciplinary hearing reference to Title 20, Section 101, or 1001.
All right, motion made to enter executive session by Mr. Kerr, seconded by Ms. Hutchinson. All those in favor? All those opposed? It is unanimous. The board is now in executive session.